Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. It's Christina from Our Home. As you can tell from the title of this video, I'm going to be showing you how I make a blueberry sourdough coffee cake. This recipe does have sourdough discard, and if you have no idea what that is, I will put a link in the top of this video for my video about sourdough baking and sourdough discard. If you don't have that or have no interest in using sourdough discard, I'll also be writing out a recipe that does not contain that, and it will be posted in the comments of this video so you can still make it. But if you do have some sourdough discard in your fridge, this is a great recipe to use it up. I'll be showing you what I'm doing for the recipe in this video and also just explaining it a little bit, but the full recipe will be posted in the description of the video so that you have it handy for you. So to start, I'm mixing 1 cup flour and 3/4 cups of large flake oats in a big bowl. To that you add 1 teaspoon of baking powder and 3/4 teaspoon of salt. Mix this nicely in a medium-sized bowl. It doesn't have to be a big one, just a medium or a small is even fine. After that, you're going to take your cold butter, 1/3 cup, and blend that into your dry mixture. I use a pastry blender because that's what I have, but if you have a knife, if you just have forks, you can use that, or if you want to use your hands to crumble it up as if you were making pie dough, that's fine too. I suppose you could even just cut the butter into very small pieces with a knife and mix it in with a spoon or spatula. But as I said, I have a pastry blender, so that's what I'm going to be using. Before I started anything with sourdough last year, I was making this recipe a fair bit, but of course without any sourdough discard, so it has been modified from my original recipe, which you'll see in the comments if you look at the non-sourdough version. The original recipe does contain white sugar, so that's what I would always use, but recently we've been trying to cut out some processed sugar and replace it with a more natural type of sweetener. So I chose honey because that's what I have. I suppose if you had maple syrup or some other type of granular sugar substitute, you could use that as well. But I have only tested this recipe with white sugar and also with honey and have had good results with both. But if you choose to use a different sweetener, please let me know how that turns out in the comments. I'd be curious to know what type of sweetener you use and if it affected the texture at all. So into the bowl goes 1/3 cup of liquid honey. I'm using raw unpasteurized, that's locally sourced, but of course you can use whatever honey you have, or if you choose to use a different sweetener, that's fine too. I would like to try this with maple syrup. I think that would taste really nice. Once all the honey is scooped out, we're going to add 1/4 cup of sourdough discard. If you have watched my previous sourdough video, you may know that sourdough discard could have different consistencies. It might look different than mine. That's totally fine. Mine tends to be a little bit more runny, but if yours is a bit thicker, you could do maybe a little bit less discard, see how the batter looks, and if it needs a bit more moisture, you could add a little bit extra. But I find that 1/4 cup is perfect based on my sourdough starter. To this, we're going to add 3/4 cup of milk. I've also used water instead of milk, and I'm sure if you chose to use something like almond milk, oat milk, that kind of thing, it would taste just as fine and have a very nice finished texture as well. I just happened to have milk and needed to use it up, so that's why I chose to do that this time. But as I said, water works just fine. You'll want to just give this a gentle mix, making sure that you incorporate all the flour, but don't over mix it, otherwise you'll get a tough, dense cake. If that's what you're going for, then I suppose you could over mix it, but I think doing just a few mixes, just so everything is nicely incorporated and so that you don't see any large chunks of flour, is ideal. As I said, I'm using frozen blueberries, 1 cup of them, but you can use fresh. You could also, in theory, use other types of fruit if you wanted to, but I've only done this with blueberries. If you're concerned about over-mixing while the blueberries are being incorporated, you could always leave the blueberries out for now, gently mix it together, and then when you pour your mixture into the cake pan, you could sprinkle the blueberries on it that way if you're concerned about possibly over-mixing. I like to use blueberries because it kind of turns the batter a nice purple color and it's pretty. When I was making this recipe without sourdough, it calls for sprinkling brown sugar on the top, and it's very delicious, but since we're trying to cut out processed sugars, we found that a nice drizzle of honey was a much lighter option, and it still provided a nice bit of sweetness. So that's what I did here. You could use the brown sugar method instead if you wanted, but I find just a nice drizzle of honey is perfect. I still like to sprinkle a little bit of cinnamon on it as well, like the original recipe calls for, but it's not overpowering, and we've found that using brown sugar sometimes left crystals of sugar on the top of the cake, and that was kind of hard to bite and left a weird texture. So liquid sweetener works just fine. I'm using a pumpkin spice blend that I made myself, but you can just use straight cinnamon, or if you have a prepackaged pumpkin or apple pie spice blend, that would work just as nicely. Or you don't have to do that at all. You can just do a little bit of your sweetener of choice, or just leave it plain on top, and it's just as delicious. Here is what the cake looks like with the cinnamon and the honey drizzle on top. I like a lot of cinnamon flavor, so that's why I did a fair bit, but if that's not something you're into, you can do less. It's totally fine, up to you. This goes into a preheated oven that's been preheated to 375 Fahrenheit, and it bakes for 25 to 30 minutes. I always do 25 and then use a metal cake tester to make sure it's cooked all the way through, and if it's not, I'll bake it for an additional 5 minutes, but 25 minutes seems to be just perfect with my oven on the convection setting. After it is finished baking, I'm just setting it on an old wooden cutting board that I use to protect my counter, but you can set it on a cooling rack or anything else that you want, just out of the way until it cools down. I think it tastes best when it's warm, so I like to wait a little bit just until it's warm to the touch and then serve it up. It's also really good with ice cream or whipped cream or anything like that, but it's delicious on its own. So here's what it looks like, nice and fluffy. We really like this coffee cake. We'll eat it for breakfast as well as snack or dessert. It's a really easy, nice recipe, and it's really fun for springtime too. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you give this recipe a try. If you do, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to know how it works, and if you choose to use any alternate sweeteners, or maybe try a different fruit. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day.